All right, in this example, we'll take a look at how liberals and conservatives can frame the concept of justice in different ways. In particular, we'll look at whether or not there is a sense in which there are fair wages in a market economy. And we'll see that liberals and conservatives have different understandings of what fairness or justice would be when considering wages in the economy. The example looks like this. So imagine an employer is seeking to hire some workers, right, to do some work. Now, we're going to ask the employer, what's the highest wage that the employer would pay to have the work done? Then we're also going to ask the worker, what's the lowest wage that the worker would accept to do the work? Now, it's possible that the number is exactly the same. If so, they would be able to agree to that wage. But more likely, there's going to be a difference between the worker's number and the employer's number. Let's take a look at these numbers here. Suppose the lowest wage they would work for would be $10 an hour. Notice, though, the employers would be willing to pay $20 an hour, right? Now, of course, they don't tell each other that in these sorts of market negotiations, but these would be the facts. So the employers have made a judgment that they would be willing to pay $20 an hour. They could still be a profitable business even if they paid $20 an hour for that work, yet the workers are willing to take the work for $10 an hour. Now, the fact that there is a difference between these two numbers, we're going to call that a social surplus. And we'll say, here it is, the wage scale here. The question about fairness is whether it is or is not a matter of fairness where the wage ends up on this scale. Clearly, if the wage ends up down here, that's better for the employer and worse for the worker. If the wage is up here, that's better for the worker, but and not as good for the employer. Right? But nevertheless, any wage in between 10 and 20 will be agreed to by both the employer and the worker. So here's where liberals and conservatives then can have a different frame of fairness. Conservatives are going to take the position that because any wage here would be agreed upon by both the employer and the worker, that the precise placement of the wage is not a matter of fairness. Any wage here is a fair wage, right? So from the conservative point of view, the scale here, the placement of the wage, is not a matter of justice. It's not that this wage is more fair than this wage. All wages are fair because both have agreed to it. In other words, conservatives are sort of suggesting that the process of negotiation, two free individuals coming to an agreed upon contract, that process legitimizes any wage here. All wages here are fair. Now, liberals take a different view. Liberals want to argue that wages down here are less fair than wages up here, right? And in fact, some might argue that wages down here can sometimes be an example of exploitation. But clearly, though, liberals want to say it is a matter of justice where the wage lands on this scale. So, in a sense, while conservatives see the process of negotiation between free parties coming to a contract, that process legitimizes or makes fair all wages here, liberals want to say we have to look at the outcome of these market negotiations. And when wages are low, it means that there are lots of workers in an economy with low wages, and that is not fair. The outcome is not fair. Whereas the conservatives will say, but the process was fair. Liberals will say, but the outcome is not fair. So liberals are especially worried that in the economy there can be social forces that push the wage down towards the low end of the spectrum here, right? And those social forces then are, in a sense, causing workers to have lower wages than they might otherwise. So those social forces, in a sense, force workers to be exploited, as it were. Now, what are some of these social forces that might push the wage down? Well, if there's a lot of workers out there who are desperate for jobs, right, then employers can find workers who will work for lower and lower and lower wages. Also, if it's just understood to be a norm in society, free market norms, that there is no such thing sort of as a fair wage, it's just whatever the market sets as a wage is the wage, is an acceptable wage, because we trust in the free market system. So that the notion of a fair wage is sort of inapplicable in a situation like this. So if we all sort of just think that, well, a fair wage is whatever the free market determines, and there are lots of folks who are desperate for work, then that's going to tend to push the wages down. And then you'll have a lot of people with low wages. So liberals are worried about these forces that push wages down. After all, employers would be willing to pay higher wages, but there might be social pressures pushing the wages down. Now, for liberals, then, there are remedies to this. For example, perhaps empathy again, right? We can just sort of, what if we just care about workers who have low wages? What if employers cared about their workers and the wages they were making? What if others in society cared and put social pressure on employers to raise wages, et cetera, right? So these norms would be a force in the opposite direction to push the wage back up. Unions, historically, from the liberal point of view, were institutions to empower workers, right? And so the effect of unions was to push wages up, right? So again, unions are often associated with the left. Notice again, Corey Robin would argue, right? The labor movement was a democratic social movement of emancipation. Workers fighting against exploitation, trying to increase their wages and better their working conditions, and conservatism was reacting against that. But in any event, we've got these opposing social forces that can influence how we think about the fairness or not of wages along the scale. So to recap then, conservatives focus on the process of the negotiation. In other words, since there's an equality of freedom between the employer and the worker, any wage here is, in a sense, fair. Or in other words, it's just not a matter of justice where the wage is. For liberals, they focus on the outcome. When wages are pushed down here, they're going to say that's unfair. And their understanding of what's happening in society is that there's an unequal freedom due to unequal power. So workers are really not free. So conservatives say everybody's free here because they both agree to the wage. Liberals are going to say no. Remember, their concept of freedom was the freedom from poverty. So this notion of empowerment then is key. Employers have greater power over workers, and so from the liberal point of view, this is not a fair transaction because employers have greater power over workers, and consequently that'll be a force to pressure the wages lower than what liberals think is fair. So liberals are going to endorse and support social forces to shift that wage up, right? Whereas conservatives tend to see this as not a matter of fairness and, in fact, endorse policies and norms that tend to push the wage down. Now let's make one final connection. You'll recall that we've talked about rising inequality in society. So here we have a little graph here, percent increase over time. And we've seen data that suggests that productivity of the American worker has risen significantly over the decades, but wages have stagnated. Well, what this means is workers are being more productive, so they're generating more revenue, right? They're generating more product for the same amount of labor. So there's increased profits being had in the economy, but the wages haven't been going up at the same rate as productivity. And that suggests that this extra profit that's being produced is going somewhere, but evidently it's not going to the workers. And so this kind of analysis helps us sort of understand part of this puzzle, right? Where is this profit going? Well, we can kind of see, remember this social surplus here. If the wages are down here as opposed to up here, then it's going to be the employers and the owners that are going to be reaping a greater reward from the increase in productivity. So these are big questions for a society to figure out. How are we going to share? How are we going to share this surplus here, right? And again, one political team, conservative, says, well, this is not a matter of kind of sharing or, will be shared somehow, but it's not a matter of fairness how it gets shared. And liberals are going to say it is a matter of fairness. And now one final connection to Nick Hanauer's point, where that business owners remind us that they are job creators, right? And the idea there was they're making a claim to social status. So when asking, how much do workers deserve, how much do owners deserve of this, by persuading the society that employers are high status individuals, right? That would be then another argument to justify why it is okay if the wage is lower down here. They are creating the job in the first place, and so they should be reaping some kind of benefit from that. And the benefit would be paying a lower wage than they'd be willing to pay. Another way to think about that is that conservatives tend to embrace a notion of fairness as proportionality, right? Sort of that you get out of something what you put into it. And if employers are kind of doing more in the arrangement, they're taking more risk and they're setting up the business and then they deserve more, right, than just the worker who's doing the work. Liberals tend to embrace other conceptions of fairness besides just proportionality, more like either equality or based on need, but also there is a recognition on the part of liberals that proportionality is an important element of fairness. But nevertheless, we can see employers arguing for a higher status in society. That's going to help them justify reaping greater benefits when the wage is low.